All right. Before we get started, all 5 of us need to sing happy birthday to Ben. So, happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Ben. Happy birthday to you.
Hey.
Oh, yeah, exactly. That's right. Birthday's tomorrow. He asked him this morning, he's like, I forgot it was my birthday. love you, Lord, for your mercy never fails me. All my days I've been held in your hands. From the moment that I wake up till I lay my head, I will sing of the goodness. I love you, Lord. I love you, Lord, for your mercy never fails me. All my days I've been held in your hands. From the moment that I wake up till I lay my head, I will sing of the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so good. Every breath that I have taken, I will sing of the goodness. I love your voice. I love your voice. You have led me through the fire and darkness. You are close like no other. I know you as a father, know you as a friend, and I have lived in the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so good. Every breath that I have taken, I will sing of the goodness of my life. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so good. Every breath that I have taken, I will sing of the goodness of God. Your goodness is running out. Your goodness is running out. It's running out to me. Your goodness is running out. It's running out to me. My life laid down, surrender now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running out. It's running out to me. All my life I've been faithful. All my life I've been so good. Every breath that I have taken, I will sing of the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so good. Every breath that I have taken, I will sing of the goodness of God. I will sing of the goodness. So I'm already singing that just to be able to say that. It's been through some really rough times in the past year, and in the midst of it, he was always good, always. And even in the midst of some really dark things, we can sing that, and it's true. And what a powerful thing to be able to suffer and at the same time sing, all my life you have been so, so good. That is unchanging. So just real quick, Just sing it one more time with me. All my life. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so good. With every breath that I am breathing, I will sing of the goodness. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so good. With every breath that I am breathing, I will sing of the goodness of God. I will sing of the goodness of God. God, thank you for being faithful all my life, all of our lives, for being good all of our lives, for being a constant good in the presence of evil, in the presence of suffering, and in the presence of pain, in the presence of loss and betrayal. You are a constant good, and there is no greater good. The comfort we receive from that, the peace we receive from that is priceless. Thank you for being with us this morning. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well. You're back. Philip, I'm back, and Philip and Dean are back, and Derek is back. Wow.
He was back last week. You were gone.
Oh, okay. Well, good to see you. Good to see you guys. I just got back from vacation on Friday. Been gone for basically 2 weeks to Mount Rushmore and kind of made a big loop. We had a great time. We were really impressed with Mount Rushmore, but what we didn't realize was that Mount Rushmore apparently was impressed with us and made some changes to reflect that. So now, when you look at Mount Rushmore, you will see Karen's face and my face on there. Yeah, we made an impression on them. It was awesome. They were the nicest people. They said, we can do this. Give us an hour and we can get your faces up there. So that was pretty good. Actually, we posted that first picture and then like not even 10 minutes later, my son Jacob had sent that back, photoshopped. I was like, this is like a magic, man. How does it do this stuff? So anyways, that was fun. We had a really good time. Just spending time with Karen. It's really good. I've mentioned before, sometimes I go on vacation and I tend to go on vacation from God too, which is an interesting, it's kind of like I'm on vacation. So now I just get to do what I want to do and everything else goes out of my mind. This was not one of those vacations. This was God was with us all the time, but he was very present to us. We relaxed. Especially Karen was able to get some time away from her responsibilities with mom and dad, as well as the responsibilities from her work, which I didn't realize was so pressing on her. That was what she said. She said, I feel so relieved. I don't have to keep checking my phone every hour to make sure there's no things that I have to do for the brother's business. That she does, just has to make sure she checks every a couple hours and answers the emails that come into her brother's business. And just that was a big thing for her to just be able to not do that. So we saw some crazy sights. We saw Mount Rushmore, Hoover Dam, the Bumpin' Buffalo Cafe. It was crazy. We saw lots of great things. We visited some family in Colorado. We visited old friends from back when we lived in the South Bay. Went to church with them last Sunday. It was kind of fun. I saw some friends, the Huckabees. We dropped by the Huckabees, had dinner with them. and some friends in Albuquerque. We got to listen to some good music on the road. We listened to podcasts, Mike Rowe, Paul Harvey, Brian Regan, and Katie Pike. We listened to Katie Pike. That was a pretty awesome talk that we heard from last week here at this place. But it was really good to get home. It was, guess what? Home feels like home. There's something about home, and we were glad to pull in and be here. Speaking of Katie's talk last week on sarcasm, I listened to it, and my first response was to send her a sarcastic response. I did the best thing. I sent her a meme that shows like the buffering sign that says something like "Hold on, sarcastic statement loading" or something like that. So that she said, "Oh, you listened to it." I said, "Yes." But that was really, really good. It shows me that God's working on Katie, just as he's working on all of us. And if we were all able to get up and maybe articulate that kind of thing, it's I listened to it, and you listen to some, I think she couched things well in the sense of setting it up, saying this is what God's doing with me right now. I'm not saying that everybody needs to follow my path, or at least he may not be dealing with you this right now on this. So it's not a matter of me trying to make you feel like you need to do this or not, but this is what God's doing in me. And as I'm listening to her, and things pop up in your mind when you hear somebody talking about something that you are kind of known for doing, and you kind of go, but you kind of remove those things, the yeah buts. We say yeah, but the yeah buts run in our heads because we're a bunch of butt heads. But if we can just remove that from us so that we can hear what's being said, what I heard was that God is working in her, and he's bringing about the kind of person that fits in well in eternity. And that's what when I heard her speaking about. And that was really good. And I know that again, if we could all kind of do that, we would hear those kind of stories from everybody. That it's funny because Paul says things like, and Jesus says the same thing, says, "Make my joy complete." And basically he just says, I want you to make my joy complete just kind of by doing the things that I've just told you to do. Do the right things, do the good things, and that will make you're listening to me, right? That's what Jesus, you know how you love me is if you do what I tell you to do. And all he's saying is if you're listening to me, and you're trusting me, and you're following what I'm telling you to do, and you are reaping the benefits of that, and that makes my joy complete as you are turning into this person that fits into eternity. And so there's a little bit of that in me, knowing that I'm not Paul and I'm not Jesus, but I'm finding these things and I'm kind of putting them out there, and people and you are taking them seriously and listening to God and going where He takes you, and those are, again, I probably would not have come up with sarcasm, although I may have used it as an example in the past, but I don't really mean to get rid of my sarcasm. I kind of tell you that you ought to, but I don't want to do it. No, but I'm just the fact that that's what God hit her with, and she's working. I'm listening to them saying and that's why we need everybody. That's why the body is the body. We need to hear those kind of things, because that encourage me to follow hard after God and become that kind of person that He sees me at this point even being. So anyways, I want to get back into Philippians. Once again, the temperature in here has been really good, but now, I don't know about you saying now it's standing up, it's kind of hot here, so I'm going to turn the AC for a second. And it's not even that warm. It's not going to come on you. How do you like that? It's just, I'm hot. I'm hot. So since I'm hot, let's get into this, all right? So Philippians, I want to go over again, because take this from another angle too. If you want to turn to chapter 2, we're going to go through 1 through 4 again. And we've been here because there's there's a lot of stuff that is here. And I believe that this is what God is doing with us right now. He's showing us what kind of a church we're supposed to be. And Paul is laying this out. Paul is just taking the language and the teachings of Jesus that he's placed in his life. He has incorporated into his life. He has become in his own life. He has seen that it is the good way. And he has taught this small band of believers in the city of Philippi to do the same thing. And I think that, as I've spoken before in the past month or so, that through the ages, since this was written, and since Jesus walked the earth, the church trying to do the best that it can, drifts away. We're trying to make our way back to whatever that important thing is. Again, things like programs, in one sense, the church needs to be about stuff. But I think that as we get to be about stuff, we lose the thing that is most important. And that's Jesus. That's why for a pastor whose work is studying and trying to listen to God, and everything that I do during the week when I go on vacation, it's like, good, now I don't have to study and listen to God because I'm on vacation. And just to say it out loud sounds really weird, but yet that's kind of what we do. And and so anyways, just getting back to the essential things, and then trying to figure out, just let those essential things blossom and bloom and show us what we're supposed to do, as opposed to following the fruit, going back to the root. Remember, instead of trying to keep the fire, loving the warmth and the heat and the light from the fire, going back to the fire itself. And Paul does this with this group. And so I want to look at this today through the eyes of N.T. Wright, who has written a commentary for every man, he calls it. This is called Paul for Every Man. He goes through these books. And so he's taken his huge intellect and huge understanding of stuff and kind of, he wouldn't say dumb it down, but it's basically N.T. Wright for dummies. And rather than read the whole thing, which was my original intent, because it's really, really good, I'm just going to read the beginning, and then I want to make some comments on it. And then I'll go to the conclusion, is his conclusion. But I'm going to read the first 4 verses. I'm going to read it this time out of he has his own translation. He's that kind of a smart guy. He can do that. So he has his own translation of the New Testament. He's a New Testament scholar. And I want to read his version of the first 4 verses, make a few statements from his introduction, and then go into my statement. So it says this, it says, so if our shared life in the King brings you any comfort, if love still has the power to make you cheerful, if we really do have a partnership in the Spirit, if your hearts are at all moved with affection and sympathy, then make my joy complete. Bring your thinking into line with one another. And here's how to do it. Hold on to the same love. Bring your innermost lives into harmony. Fix your minds on the same object. Never act out of selfish ambition or vanity. Instead, regard everybody else as your superior. Look after each other's best interests, not your own. I'm going to read that again. And not that I read it fast, but I'm going to read it slow, because it's interesting when he says, here's how to do it. Don't we all want to know how to do it? I mean, we don't want to just be told, do this, be this. We want to know how to do it. And he tells us how to do this basic, fundamental, most important thing that Jesus has laid out for. And now Paul is just trying to get them to lay out. He says, so if our shared life in the King brings you any comfort, if love still has the power to make you cheerful, if we really do have a partnership in the Spirit, if your hearts are all moved with affection and sympathy, then make my joy complete. Bring your thinking into line with one another. Here's how to do it. Here's how to bring your thinking in line with one another. One, hold on to the same love. Right? That's, we've heard the, maybe you haven't heard, but in marriage counseling, Christian marriage counseling, there's the triangle that if both of you are going towards Jesus, you are actually growing closer together because you've got the one thing that you're trying to get closer to. That's that one love. That if we were all holding on to one love, we would all be growing closer together. He says, bring your innermost lives into harmony. The lives that are on the inside, the lives that we live. Fix your mind on the same object, which is Jesus and his kingdom. Never act out of selfish ambition or vanity, right? What I want, my ambition or vanity is, I think I'm smarter than you guys. I really do. I may not think that I do, but I do, because if we disagree, guess what? I choose me over you. So I think that I'm smarter than you on everything. So basically selfish means that me, the self, my ambition, what I want and what I think. Never act out of what I want or what I think. Instead, regard everybody else as your superior. But they're not my superior. Sometimes I want something that's better. And sometimes I think, says, no, that's not your starting point. That's not how you all come into line. You need to put the others better than yourself. Look after each other's best interests, not your own. Well, then how can I have my interests looked after? Trust. Number one, God has set it up so that others will look after your best interests. And even if they fail to do what they're supposed to do, God's got your back. And he's better than the sum total of everybody else in your life at watching out for your best interest. So then he goes on, he said, this is intro. We sat and watched spellbound as the actors moved at what seemed like the speed of light. It was a complex and intricate play with many layers and double or triple meanings. At times, things were happening so fast all around the stage that it was more like a circus act than a play. Everybody had to know exactly where to be and what to do so that the next move would work out all right. And then the next, and the next. It was like watching a highly complex piece of machinery with all its cogs and wheels working together in perfect harmony. That's a bit like what Paul is urging on this little church in Philippi. On stage, the actors were not out for their own individual glory at each other's expense. If one single actor had tried to steal the limelight from the others, the whole thing would have fallen apart. It only worked because everyone was working together with the same object in view. They had the same goal. And that's how the church should be too. If you read these verses in any other way, they sound, quite frankly, almost laughably impossible. There's an old Jewish joke that says, if you've got two rabbis, you've probably got three opinions. And often the church seems like that as well. Not only are there big theological differences, smoldering resentments from historical events long ago, and radical variations in style of worship, there are also personality cults, clashes over leadership style, arguments on issues of moral behavior, cultural politics, and so on. So I want to stop there. So I want to just, we hear that and go, yeah, that's right. But each one of those, there are examples of that hit close to home if we stop and we think about that. And so I just want to go over that this quickly, and then I want to answer a question that has come up in my mind, and I know it's come up in others' minds because I heard somebody talking about it. And that is, so we'll get there in a second. There are big theological differences, smoldering resentments from historical events long ago. Now, on one hand, these kind of things probably don't really affect most of us, but they affect things. I had met a pastor here in town. This is probably, well, it's been, everything's over a year ago, right? Nothing's happened last year. So met a pastor in town, and he was from a small church with a big denomination, but a small splinter group of that big denomination. And I'm not going to say what it is, because it's not, the example is not about slamming denominations. It's just about saying who we are. And basically, I never heard of this small splinter group. I'd heard of other groups in this larger denomination, out of this larger denomination. So I went home and I talked to him. I said, "Oh, I'm part of the pastors in town. We get together." He didn't want to have anything. He was polite, but he basically politely said, "Thanks, but no thanks. We don't do that." And I went, that's an interesting response, because I have met a lot of pastors that everybody is always going, "Oh yeah, I'd love to." Now they meet in practice, like a lot of the stuff in our minds, we go, "Oh yeah, I'd like to sometime sit and have lunch with you. I'd love to do it." But when it comes down to the nitty gritty, it's like, nah, I really don't want to. And so I'll come up with reasons why. And so that never takes place. Well, he was just out front saying, and again, he was polite. He wasn't mean. He just was saying, that's not something that we do. So I went back got home, got on Google, going, what is it that they do, and or why? And so I did some research, and basically, again, I don't know, I'm sure it was much more complex than this, but it seems like back when this big denomination broke up into various splinter groups over a question of communion, and not just what communion is, but what you have to believe to partake of communion. And then they break it up into, well, there's fellowship around communion, and then there's a lesser fellowship which they call table communion, or table fellowship, meaning I'll eat with you, and this is where, well, I'll hang around with you, but I won't take communion with you unless you're like this. So there's like these levels of fellowship, and then there's I won't even have table fellowship with you. So there's all these different levels, and so it's from my reading was that basically it's this. So you had the bigger thing, and then they had this disagreement about this theological issue. So you had A saying, which was the bigger part, saying, we can do this. And B and C said, no, you can't do this. So B and C split off from A, and B and C were of one mind, except that B said, if we hang out with these guys, we feel like we can get them back into what they're supposed to be. C said, no, Bible says you're supposed to cut off fellowship, need to cut off fellowship. And so B stayed for a while trying to get A to change. And then they eventually said, they're not changing, so we're cutting fellowship off. So now, and so B came to C and said, so now we're not dealing with, so C was not dealing with A or B at this time, because B was trying to help A. And so now B is no longer connected to A, so B says, so we've done that, so now we want to have fellowship. Well, that sounds really good, but let's go talk about it. So they went to talk about it. They came back and said, no, the fact that you thought that you could change them meant that we need to cut out, that you, it just kind of, I'm reading it, I'm just going, that's kind of crazy. And again, I'm not, to them, that's why I don't want to say their name, because it's important to them. It's important, and I'm not saying that that it should be more important. I'm just saying that's their thing. You and I may have another thing, right? So it may not be this theological, but it very well may be. Again, we're a very small group, right? So it's got like, it's not hard to find 20 people that believe the same theological stuff as you. So that might not be an issue with us sitting in this room, but it might be an issue if, say, we were dealing with a church, trying to be the church together. But he gets into other things. He says radical variations in styles of worship. Just think about that. There's contemporary courses, there's hymns, there's loud, there's soft, there's it's not just music. There's casual, there's suits, they're casual and cool like me and us. there are robes. It's called, you certain churches, they call it bells and smells. They have all the bells and smells. That means they have the incense and the bell. So just all that kind of stuff, all the way to, high church, all the way down to, I guess, low church. I've only heard high church, but I'm assuming that means that there's a low church, of which we probably would be low church. There are people that if they walk, and they do, they walk in here and they see how we do things, our style, and it doesn't fit them, and they turn around and they leave. And so there are those things. There are he calls them personality cults. And now we wouldn't think of personality cults, but think about it. There's Paul in 1 Corinthians is talking about, hey, there are those that follow Paul, there are those that follow Apollos, there are those that follow Peter or Cephas, there are those that even say they follow Jesus, because they're teaching styles, what they're teaching about, the way they do it. And Paul's going, you guys don't understand anything at all. If you are only wanting to go and listen to the person that you want to speak to teach, when God has placed all these teachers in the church to do the same thing. We're not divided. It's you guys that are divided. And if they had the ability in that time to go and start another church, they would have done that. And people eventually did. But there was only one church, so they couldn't. So they stayed in the one church, but they did the same thing without physically going someplace else. They just started talking amongst themselves, and there would be little groups of Apollos followers and Paul followers and Jesus. They said, we only follow Jesus. Well, that's your non-denominational church. We only follow Jesus. We don't follow him. It's like, you're doing the same thing. And it's not that we shouldn't follow Jesus. That's a good statement, but it's also can be we don't follow man. So there's churches out there that they don't have a denominational name. They consider themselves not a denominational, but their names are all the same. No matter whatever city you go to, there's this church. And I have friends in that church, and they would say we're not denominational, but they all do exactly the same theology, same stuff. And they actually will, if they know of another church in another city, which is non-denominational, not doing the things that they're supposed to, they'll go over and they'll tell them that they're not doing things that they're supposed to do. It's like, okay, so you're not denominational, but you're a denomination. So, some people want to come and hear Doug talk. Some people want to come and hear Katie talk. Some people want to hear Joel Osteen talk. We're all kind of the same. Once we got on internet, my son Josh says, now that I'm being flashed all over the world, I have as many people watching me outside of our church here than I do. They're in San Antonio, they're Albuquerque, they're everywhere. And he says, now you're just like, I'm going to start calling you Doug Osteen because you're like this mega church television guy. So just think about it. If you visit a church and you walk away, another church, you go, yeah, it was good, but I didn't really like the guy who was talking. It's like, we do that, right? We do that. And that's the way Jesus had it set up. That's just, all I'm saying is that just shows that we have in ourselves this thing that tends to work against what Paul is trying to get us to do. He says clashes on the leadership style. There's some that are more authoritarian. There's some that, again, it can be in a good way. You've got a pastor-led church. You have other churches that are board-led churches or other elder-led churches. There are different kinds of leadership style. There are sometimes people, they want somebody to tell them, this is what God's word said to do. Yes, and other people say, well, let's hear from other people as well. Let's be a little bit more inclusive. There are arguments on issues of moral behaviors, the do's and don'ts. When I was growing up, before I became a Christian, it was the typical thing was, I don't smoke or drink or chew or go out with girls that do. That was kind of the saying. So there was these things that you didn't do. My pastor that once I did become a Christian, he grew up in the Pentecostal Holiness, this denomination. He said they didn't go to movies. And he said, for one reason, and he laughed about it. He's kind of talking about what he grew up in. He said because we thought that Jesus could come at any moment for the rapture, and if Jesus came for the rapture and he found you in a movie theater, you might not be able to make it home. And he just started laughing because he knew how ridiculous it sounded, but that's what he had grown up with, and he believed it growing up in it. But there are moral behavior, homosexuality, abortion, drinking, movies, things like that, cultural politics, presidential races, gun control, immigration, and they said, and so on, pandemics, masks, and vaccines. I mean, there's all kinds of things going on, and that are real. That all these things that I'm just touched on these things. They're all reasons that tend to make people do this kind of a thing, and to divide, not to come together, which is what Paul is talking about. That regardless of any of those things, that we should be moving towards becoming of one mind. Now that brings me to a question of which I had as I've been studying this, but Katie talked about a conversation she had with Maggie about this same question, and it's because great minds think alike. Me and Maggie, we got the same thought process going on. It's like, where do you draw the line on this though? Is there a line to be drawn? Is there nothing that you're supposed, where you take a stand? And I would say that Jesus took a stand. I think Paul took a lot of stands on a lot of things. So yes, there are lines to be drawn. Paul in chapter 3, verse 2, and we'll get there, but this isn't a main thing that I was going to talk about, but that's why I'm bringing it right now. But he says this, he says, beware of dogs, beware of evil workers, beware of the mutilation. And basically he's referring to the people who were going around saying that you needed to be circumcised, which was a big issue back then. Apparently it was addressed by the church to say that you don't need to do that, but yet there were still so many people that were so connected to the old that they could not understand or see that you could be a good Christian following God and break God's law, which God had laid down a law. You get circumcised. I mean, there was something to it. It wasn't something just made out of the clear air. There was scriptural backing of it, and yet Paul and the New Testament church leaders understood that this was no longer the issue that it was, that this had been fulfilled, and it was no longer an obstacle to the Gentiles becoming one, because without becoming circumcised. But because they didn't have text messaging and emails and all that, it was hard. It wasn't like the church headquarters the mother church could send out an email to every church like Vineyard does to us when they want us to all to know something. They just said, they basically said it. They came to a decision. They sent out Paul, and Paul would go out and they'd say, hey, this is what they said. And it was great. And then Paul would go someplace else, and then the other people come in and go, think about it. Paul's wrong because here's the scripture, here's the Old Testament, blah, blah, blah. And they would go through all this stuff, and people would get confused, and they would start to walk away from Paul. Even Peter scooted away from Paul when these people came into town, because they were very legalistic. And again, they were coming from a certain place. It sounded really good. But Paul said, no, there's a line to be drawn there. He said, Paul comes up with all kinds of lines. If you're this kind of person, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. He lays a lot of stuff down. Jesus is the same thing. I said we were in church last week in Colorado. They were teaching on Revelations 2:20, and it's Jesus speaking to the churches, and it's speaking to Thyatira, and he says, hey, you guys are doing great. Oh, you guys are doing great. He says, but I have this one thing against you. You allow this woman Jezebel, to teach all these things. And he says, you've got to stop that. And basically he's saying, the whole thing, I've heard stuff about Jezebel. I mean, it's this teaching, but basically it had to do with sexual immorality and joining in with these pagan idol festivals and joining in with what's going on. And he says, that's a lie. What are you doing? Even Paul went to the Corinthians and said, you've got a guy in your church. I hear you have a guy in your church who's sleeping with his mother-in-law. He's going, even the people outside the church go, that is wrong. He says, what are you people doing? You think you're being open-minded and forgiving and free to letting people be who they're supposed to be. He says, but what are you guys doing? You were called to be a certain kind of people, and that is not the kind of people that you are called to be. And you need to put that person out. I mean, he was big on drawing the lines, and yet at the same time, he's telling these people to come and to think alike and live within these boundaries. So to answer the question, Maggie and Katie, yes, that's my answer. And again,
What was the question?
the question was, are there lines? If we're supposed to just let everybody have their own view on stuff, are there lines to be drawn? And there are lines to be drawn. And I believe that those lines need to be addressed, but I think that it was one thing back here when you had, I don't want to get off the camera, when you had one church trying to be one. By the time you show up in the 21st century and there are 50,000 denominations and ways of looking at it, that to start off by saying, let's go through all these things and make sure that we're lined up on these things before we can even have table fellowship with you, we're never going to do it, because you're going to find something that you don't agree. So we can't start there. I believe that we need to start where Paul starts when he says things like, when I came to you, I didn't want to know this, I didn't want to know that, I didn't want to know anything about you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. That's that one object, that's that one love that we need to start at. And as we get closer to them, then we can begin to address some other issues. But there are issues that need to be addressed. But I think that we need to start by saying, there's got to be a lot of grace going, because I've got so many different facets of myself that don't line up with the facets of you, let alone the people that are going to another church that Jesus loves just as much as he loves us. That we have to start with Jesus and start there. He goes on to say, how can we even begin to think that it might be possible to live the way Paul indicates here? Thinking the same, loving each other completely, regarding everyone else and their opinions as superior to you and your own? The answer must be that everyone must be focused on something other than themselves and their ambitions and their what they think. And that something is Jesus Christ himself, the King, the Lord, and the good news which has come to take over the world in his name. What's that good news? That we're all part of his family, and we should act the same, and we should be about his business in this world. I just want to throw this out here, because as I was driving, I did a lot of driving over the past 2 weeks, and that left me with a lot of time for thinking. And I was thinking about what I talked about last week when I said to pray about what God wants us to do. Where are we supposed to go when we don't have the building in a couple of months? And what does that look like? And lay your options on the table, and listen back for him. And just so I hope you are doing that. I've heard back yesterday from one person, and that's fine. But I want to hear back. If whatever it is that God tells you, I want to hear what it is. And it may not be the whole picture. It may be one word, or maybe one slice, one piece of the puzzle. But it's us trying to hear from our Father what he wants us to do as a group. And so it's important. If you, I'm trusting that you are still praying about that. But I, at various times, thinking about the options that I had come up with and saying, how would that look? And I'm not saying that this is it. Just as I was thinking about this one option, these kind of things came into play. And that one option is, what if God wants us to merge with another church or other churches? And I'm thinking that would, in my mind, would be something that God would want, right? I mean, on the surface level, he wants us to be one. And so to me, that could be something that he would like. And my thoughts went to, wouldn't that be awesome if a number of churches could come together and be one church in Livermore and touch, and we could do so much because Jesus says, this is it, is you be one, even as I am one. And if you would do that, then the world will know. And there's so much that I think is being held back because the church isn't one. And then my next thought goes to, I would have to subjugate my opinions on many things, including these things I just read off. But God would really want it. And then I thought about various people that I know, and pastors, and what it would take to take our church and the way they run their church and put them together. And I came to the conclusion it'd be very hard. It would be, even though I like to think that, and I'm very romantic and very, I like to think about this kind of, this would be so pleasing to God, and I love to do it. And then, but when you get down to nitty gritty, you just say, it just would be really, really hard. And yet, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, it would be hard for me. But if it would be hard for me, but it would be pleasing for God. Again, I'm not saying this about what we're doing. I'm just saying that as I was going through this one option thing. But is that what this is all about? This is all about me getting to worship, wearing the clothes that I like, to the songs that I love, by the person who I love so much, who is up here singing it. And we've got a few of those people that I love, Katie being the one today. With our little group, doing the things that, again, there are things that I do up here that would not fly in a lot of churches. And would that mean that I would not be up here? Would I have some other aspect? Again, there's so many things that when you get to the nitty gritty, that's where the rubber meets the road. What is it called? The devil's in the details, right? That's right. You got this great idea, this great plan, and then when you start to work it out, that's when you get people going, I don't want to do that. I don't like that. I don't even think that's theologically correct. Again, and all these things come into play. And so I'm just throwing that out. Like, what if giving God glory was a bigger reason than making me comfortable? Again, I'm not saying that's what we're doing. I'm just throwing that out there, dude. Because on one hand, it's easy to do, and I think that we do a pretty good job of that. I think that we could probably be more aggressively loving towards one another, being involved in each other's life. I see people that are in small groups, they have the opportunity to be able to do that more, because at least they see each other on a Zoom call or maybe in a group on a weekly basis, and they pray for each other so that they're more connected to be able to do that. But I don't think that we're quite there yet. We have a ways to go, but I don't think that we do a terrible job. But again, move that out to the bigger thing. And what if giving God glory was a bigger reason than making me comfortable? What does God want? So that moves me to the conclusion, N.T. Wright's conclusion. He says, I remember once going to a lunch with a friend who had invited about 20 or 30 people. Some of them were quite well-known public figures, which I'm being N.T. Wright, he probably knows, he runs in those kind of crowds. As this friend of his was saying grace at the start of the meal, he also said very firmly, remember, the most interesting person in the room is the one that you're sitting next to. Okay, imagine if you're sitting next to somebody who is famous, that famous person may want to be sitting next to somebody else who's famous rather than you. And I remember one time I was in junior college. I didn't go to big, adult college. I just went to junior college. And a friend of mine who I grew up with in high school his family was well off. They owned a lot of agriculture, the Mariani's. And you can get Mariani dried fruits, and still to this day they're a big company. And because he had gone to school at the same time in the same college with a gal who was married to a guy a big vineyard up in the Saratoga Hills. They were doing this thing where they had to do some grape harvesting. And so it was by invitation only to get paid $2.50 an hour to harvest grapes. So he said, "Hey, you want to come?" I said, "Sure, why not?" So we cut grapes in the morning, and then and you're on a hillside, and up on there's a big old pad with it's huge. It'd be like a wedding venue these days. They didn't do wedding venues back then like that. And they had this big bell, so they ring the bell at lunchtime. They served you lunch. So we all went. There's this long table with 30 people there, and you could see the other people. They were like testing and the chemical thing on the grape as they were cutting. So all the people that were there cutting, they were all like into this thing. They had different connections, except for me. I was like the third generation. I'm just trying to get $2.50 an hour, man. And so we're eating lunch. I ended up sitting next to the old guy, the patriarch of the family. He was at the head of the table, and his son, who ran the place, he and his wife actually served them. They served us. And so I'm sitting next to this old guy, and he is talking to me as if I'm the most interesting person in the room, because he can't be heard by the people that are down there, who he knows. He doesn't know. I'm, like I said, 3 degrees of separation from why are you even here? He's just talking, and he's had presidents there. He's had all these famous movie actors. He's had politicians that had sat where I had sat before. And he's just telling me stories like I'm the most important person in the room. And you know what? I walked out of it thinking that was pretty important, especially after they didn't serve water, they only served wine. So you drink a lot of wine and you hear, man, I thought I went down. It was great because you go down and in the morning the bees are starting to come out. You're kind of like, you don't want to get stung, right? After a bunch of wine, you forget the bees, just cut the stuff out. It was awesome. Not the cutting the grapes for the bees or even the wine, but the point is that there's something about this important person treating me like this important person. And that's what he's saying. Remember, the most important person in the room is the one you're sitting next to. And then he finishes by saying this. Now multiply that up a bit into a congregation, and you'll get somewhere near what Paul is saying. And then even if in our minds we can multiply it to outside of our congregation to the church at large. All this too is of course impossible unless you keep your eyes fixed the whole time on the person at the center of it all. That's what Paul is now going to show us as we move further in Philippians, he says. But before we get there, we should perhaps pause. And he ends with a question that I'll end for us. Reading these verses always makes me sorry. The church has often got it so wrong. How, I wonder, can we move forward beyond frustration and penitence and towards getting it right in the future? Rather, frustration and penitence. We hear this and we go, we can't get it right. Or penitence of, I'm sorry, but okay, I did this wrong, but what can we actually do to put this into practice? Because Paul is putting it out there. Jesus is putting it out there. And so Paul, basically N.T. Wright says, Paul's going to tell us how to do that. But it's a question for us. So Father, when we can stop and look and step back and listen to somebody else lay it out, even as Katie laid out this thing that I would not necessarily have thought about, but as she's talking about it, I'm thinking, or I may have thought about it, but I've not taken it to the degree of thought and experience that she had, that as I sit back and I listen, I realize the importance of it. And it is just one thing. And the same thing listening to what Paul is saying here, and all he is saying is what you are saying, that there's this place that you have created us to be that is so different than our experience up to this point. And anywhere else we look, we're in the dark trying to find what it's supposed to look like. And you're saying, if you would just come down this path, come down this way, begin to do this, you'll see light. Even though it doesn't feel like you will end up there. It feels like you will be taken advantage of. It feels like you will not have your interests looked after. You will not have your needs met. But you are saying, just as everything else in your kingdom, that even got us to come into you, to make you the Lord and of our lives, is a surrendering, is a giving up, and it's so counterintuitive to who we are and what we've learned. And yet we've all learned that was the best decision we've ever made in our lives. And every time we say yes to what you tell us to do, even though it's stepping out of a boat, walking on a water type of a thing, this doesn't seem right. When we do it, we find that not only does it seem right, but it is so much better than we could ever imagine. And there's peace and there's love and there's joy, which is what your kingdom is all about. So Father, show us in our lives how we can do this. Show us how we can begin to put our own ambition and our own opinions to the side. Not that there's anything wrong with them necessarily, but that they are not the most important things, that the person sitting next to us is. And would you just give us the power to do that, the insight to do that, the sensitivity to do that. In Jesus' name, amen. So there you go. So until next week, trust Jesus, think better of others than yourself, and wash your hands.